Step one, you say you need to talk. He walks, you say sit down, it's just a talk. He smiles politely back at you. You step politely right.
Yeah, and Mark was just describing there the three tenets or the three principles of 12-step recovery, which are honesty, open-mindedness and willingness. And we say with these three things we are well on our way, and very much the importance of honesty, Mark. So, you know, that is the first principle of mine and many other people's recovery. So, yeah, thank you. It gives me great pleasure to announce that we now have a speaker from Public Health England who's going to be talking a wee bit more about the evidence base around spiritual pathways to recovery. Unfortunately, Tony, you've got 15 minutes, the same as every other speaker here today. So, excuse me if it's a wee bit rushed, but yeah, I'll just hand it over to you now, Tony. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Tony Mercer. I'm the drugs lead for Public Health England West Midlands Centre, and I'm a man in long-term recovery. I'll call this presentation Spiritus contra Spiritum. It's a Latin phrase. It means spirituality or the spiritual life overcomes alcoholism. And it's a quote from a letter. And I'm just going to say something about that letter because I think it provides a bit of a good backdrop to the whole conference today. The letter was written from this guy on the left, Carl Jung, to this guy on the right, Bill Wilson. Carl Jung, world-famous psychiatrist, psychotherapist, he came to the conclusion that a lot of the alcoholics he was working with actually had a spiritual malady. They were experiencing a sense of disconnectedness, isolation, and one of his patients, Roland, he discharged him and he said, "Sorry, I can't help you anymore. The only chance you've got to stop drinking is having a spiritual experience." He returned to the United States. A chain of events started that led to the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1961, Bill Wilson wrote to him and said, "Thank you for what you said to Roland." That chain of events led to Alcoholics Anonymous being formed. And in his response back, Carl Jung said, actually in Latin, we use the same word, spiritus, for alcohol and spirituality. A good formula to always remember that is spiritus contra spiritum. The spiritual life overcomes alcohol. Okay, I'm going to talk mostly about the evidence base. As I started doing some research for this presentation, I was fascinated how strong the evidence base is. I've made reference to 160 different studies. I've put them all in the slides at the back, so anyone who's interested in that kind of stuff can follow them up, you know, when the slides go round. I'm just going to give a very brief summary. Our bottom line in public health is about helping people to live longer. There's a lot of evidence that people who regularly undertake some kind of spiritual practice live longer. The studies that have referenced were carried out in different countries, different cultures, the United States, Israel and Europe. So this phenomena, the link between regular spiritual practice and living longer, is something that appears in different cultures. There's also a very strong link between spiritual practice and a whole range of physical health conditions. And the study I've outlined in red actually says that this evidence is so strong, we're not talking about a link or a correlation, we're actually talking about a causative effect. Regular spiritual practices improve physical health. Okay, next slide. The link between spirituality and mental health is even stronger. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of studies. Improves well-being, recovery from depression is much faster in people who regularly practice some kind of spiritual practices, and there's a lowering of suicide rates amongst people with depression who undertake some kind of regular spiritual practice. This is the starting point. This is where we are now in addiction treatment services, Bio Psychosocial Model. We know it's partly biological, addiction's partly psychological, and there's a social element to it. In the next 12 minutes or so, I'm going to try and convince you that we need to move to this model instead. We need to add a spiritual component to the model if we're truly going to help people get better. So, just to recap on this Bio Psychosocial Model, the bio bit, that's the domain of the psychiatrists. They tell us that addiction is a chronic brain disease. Regular use of drugs or alcohol actually changes the brain and the way it functions. What they bring to the table in terms of recovery is kind of debatable, I suppose. Mark's laughing at the front. More drugs, prescribed legal drugs rather than illegal ones. The psychologists, there's no consensus amongst psychologists about what addiction is. Different theories, like for example, it's a coping mechanism, it's a way of coping with negative emotions and stress, or it's a conditional thing, using drugs stops us having bad experiences, gives us lots of pleasure, so it's learned behaviour. So even though there's no consensus, the psychologists have given us lots of gems, things that we use like cognitive behavioural therapy, motivational enhancement and therapy and so on. Massive contribution to treatment of people with addictions. The social bit, this is kind of pretty new. This is what we've been looking at the last 10 years. The social scientists tell us that addiction is the result of some kind of dysfunctional relationship between an individual and their social environment, usually at 3 different levels: societal level, peer pressure, and dysfunctional families. And that kind of science that has developed over the last few years has led to kind of network interventions, things like peer support, assertive facilitation into mutual aid, and it's the science that underpins the growth of recovery communities, why they work and why they're absolutely essential. So was Carl Jung right? Do we need a model that includes spirituality if we're actually going to understand what addiction is and how we're going to treat it? Okay. I'm going to go very quickly back round the psychiatrists, the psychologists and the social scientists and see what they've got to say about spirituality. There's been a lot of experiments done where psychiatrists have wired people up, people like Carmelite nuns and Buddhist monks, and examined what happens to their brains when they're meditating. And they've found that there are actually brain changes that occur. It's a certain part of the brain. It's the same bit of the brain that differentiates between a person in space and other physical objects. So clumsy people who bump into things are probably hardwired to be mystics. Sorry, go back a sec. In 1999, psychiatrists set up the Spirituality and Psychiatry Special Interest Group because their interest in spirituality has just grown exponentially. So that group does the type of things that psychiatrists do, like hold conferences and swap research papers, but all the focus is very much on spirituality and its role in psychiatry. Psychologists are very, very interested in spirituality. I won't go through the whole of the slide, but throughout the history of psychology, alongside that, there's massive interest in the role of spirituality in psychology. What psychologists love doing is devising questionnaires, work out what sort of addict are you, that kind of thing. And they've developed these things like the religious orientation scale, spiritual life inventory, the spiritual experience index. In fact, a guy called D'Souza has incorporated spiritual principles into his CBT practice. The social scientists too are very, very interested in spirituality. For example, some say it's all about ritual, whether that's a high Latin mass with lots of chanting and incense, or going through the readings at the start of a 12-step meeting. It's that ritual that pulls people together. Other social scientists say, actually, it's all about positive social networks. You join a faith community, you've got a supportive group of people around you. Others talk about moral communities. It's tying people into different values and beliefs. It strikes me that we listen to the psychiatrists, the psychologists and the social scientists when they're talking about addiction and recovery. Are we going to be selective and not listen to them when they're talking about spirituality? Or do we have to take that on board as well? If we do, then we're moving towards the model on the right, the Bio Psychosocial Spiritual Model of addiction and recovery. One of the definitive papers in this area is by Professor Chris Cook, who's actually based in Durham but is on holiday, couldn't be here today. He reviewed loads and loads of papers that had been written that included the word addiction, recovery and spirituality. And these are some of the themes that came up. They tend to be the same themes that were coming up over and over again in different papers. Masses of evidence that some kind of spiritual practice is a protective factor against using drugs, alcohol and tobacco. Often it's the spiritual practices that provide meaning and purpose in life. They lead to the development of virtues like honesty and responsibility. Again, these studies carried out in different cultures around the world. This isn't just a Western phenomenon. Again, loads and loads of studies that people in treatment have better treatment outcomes if they're introduced to some kind of spiritual practice. Lots of this research has been focused on AA groups, but not exclusively. The bottom one is interesting. It doesn't matter what somebody believes when they come into treatment. Usually by that time they're broken, much more open-minded and ready to take on the whole idea of spirituality. Recovery, this is what happens after treatment, long-term recovery. Again, loads and loads of research papers saying that people have better treatment outcomes the more spiritually literate they become. However that's measured, whether that's in terms of do people relapse, how are they doing after 1 year, 5 years, 10 years and so on. So was Carl Jung right? Do we have to introduce the notion of spirituality to understand addiction and recovery? So what? Some of you people I know work with people on a daily basis who sit in front of you, their lives are broken, they go into prison, they've come out of prison, they've got nowhere to live, the kids are being removed and so on. What difference does all this make? There's an old saying that people don't recover until they see the light or feel the heat. I've worked in services for a long time. One thing I think we're very good at in services is turning down the heat. Some people say that's harm reduction. Other people say it's enabling. I think it's both. I think it's unfortunate we have to do that, but sometimes it's necessary. Some interventions like naloxone, clean needles, actually save people's lives. But I think we need to focus on the seeing the light bit a little bit more. There's 3 things that I think we can and should be doing. The first one is to carry on the debate that we're starting today. We need to differentiate between religion and spirituality. They're not the same thing. If I had the full half an hour, I'd get into that, but we can talk about that in the break. Meaning and purpose are the 2 words that keep coming up in all the research about recovery and spirituality. When we get to the question, does spirituality have to involve a higher power? I think that's when people panic and run for the hills then. Does spirituality have to involve the concept of God or a higher power? There's one camp that says, I'm still on medication, I still use recreationally, but I'm still in recovery. There's another camp of people who say, I can't use safely. Abstinence means recovery for me. So we haven't pinned down a definition of recovery. Why do we have to pin down a definition of spirituality? Let's just keep debating that. We've found common denominators across all the definitions of recovery. I'm sure we can do that with spirituality too. The second thing I think we need to do is listen to people telling their stories. In public health, we call that the narrative approach. Anne-Marie and myself were in Bristol this time last week. We listened to 3 people telling their stories on stage. One identified as a Christian, one as a Sikh, one didn't identify that they were associated with any organised religion. But all 3 of them spoke about how a power greater than themselves had restored them to sanity. And a couple of researchers have pointed out, if we're going to understand this stuff about spirituality and recovery more, we're not going to do that through counting and questionnaires and things like that. We actually need to take the cotton wool out of our mouths and put it in our ears. And finally, there is a worldwide evidence-based spiritual program of recovery. Every single person who works in services should be encouraging their clients to give that a go. I'll finish there. Thank you.